but we're getting set up here. All right, there we go. Well, before we begin, let us bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for bringing us safely here today through the snow and the cold. We thank you for all your blessings to us this week. And Lord, as we look at your word this morning, may we see our need to surrender to you in another area of our life. May we realize how much we grasp for power, and that ultimately we need to look to you for our power. We ask all this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so this is the fifth sermon on modern idolatry. We're going to be looking at power. And so power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, by Lord John Acton. Now, we're very familiar with the first sentence of this quote. And the last sentence seems a little bit awkward and perhaps wrong, but if you really think about it, it's very, very true. How many, one man's hero is another man's villain. And usually great men have to do some slightly shady things, or sometimes more than slightly shady, to get to the position that they are in. And Daniel is probably one of the best examples of someone who didn't do this. Someone who had power and yet did everything the right way. In Daniel 6, when the Persian princes tried to get rid of him, they literally couldn't find anything to accuse him of. Imagine a politician who has no skeletons in the closet. There's no dirt in his past. There's nothing on him. You can't make any of those smear commercials in the campaign against this guy. It's utterly, almost unbelievable, and yet that's exactly what was happening with Daniel. And so the princes eventually had to concoct a law that they knew he would break because it went against his morals and his religion. So why did they want to get rid of Daniel? Well, they wanted power. Not necessarily his position, although I'm sure some of them did want that. But if he doesn't have any skeletons in his closet, he can't be bought. He's a straight shooter. He's following the law. And so because he was the prime minister, he was the highest person in the Persian Empire after the king, he wasn't allowing anybody else to slide in their area. He wasn't allowing them to gain more power than they should have gotten. And so they wanted, to line their pockets more, to do whatever. And so, hey, this guy's got to go because he's messing with my potential. And so it would be fair to say that everyone wants to have power and control. Now, not everyone wants to have power for power's sake. Not everyone wants to control others. Most people don't want to be president, right? But we do want power in our own lives. We want to be able to live our lives the way that we see fit, don't we? We want at least some power in our lives. But the reality is that the control that we have is somewhat an illusion, because 95% of what makes you is completely beyond your control. Your ethnicity, gender, who your parents are, where you were born, when you were born as far as time period, your childhood environment, physical stature, and our genetically predispositioned talents and personality are all completely beyond our control. And then on top of that, there are the circumstances and situations that each of us have to deal with every single day because of the list of things I just gave you that are completely beyond, and how people react to you because of that are beyond our control. Now, I mention this not to show how weak we are and how pointless it is to struggle to change, But we all have strengths and weaknesses, and we all have the freedom of choice. But I mention our lack of control because it is probably the biggest reason why we want power and control in our lives. We usually want what we don't have, right? This is why teenagers tend to be rebellious, because they want to become independent of their parents and have control of their choices and decisions and live their life how they want to live it. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not, and the clashes tend to be epic, right? Another factor that we desire power, particularly for us, is that we're Americans. And this may seem a little weird, but the American government was unique whenever it was created because it took the power that had always been reserved for royalty and for the church clergy, and it gave it to the American people. It gave it to the people. That's why it's America, our government is a government for the people, by the people. And this is why any election, but particularly presidential elections, have always been very important, because we can exercise our right. We can put our power, our voting power, behind or for someone who will lead us and our country for the next 4 years. And in short, this idea of power has been ingrained in us for over 200 years as a nation. And in short, political ideologies have become an idol in our culture. And if you kind of disagree, here's a kind of a litmus test to see if politics is becoming an idol in your life. If you place too much of an emphasis on politics and subsequently those who run for office, so when people talk about leaving the country if their candidate doesn't win, when people say, well, I don't know how we're going to make it as a nation for the next 4 years, when seeing the candidate of the opposing party as simply not just being misguided, but as lacking moral legitimacy or being viewed as evil. When people talk about their candidate as though he or she will be the one to save the country or right the ship. When there is the idea that it is us against them, and there can be no working with the opposing party. And finally, when there is utter despair in people when their candidate loses, like we saw at the 2016 election, and that we're seeing to a lesser degree after this last election. So if any of these fit you may be down the road of creating the idol of politics and subsequently power in your life. Now, as a side note, our government system is designed to outlast and survive a few bad people in any of the three branches. And this is something that most people in America tend to forget. We have survived, as Americans, have survived some pretty bad situations. The Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. We've had 4 presidents assassinated, a president who slept for 15 hours a day, Calvin Coolidge, one of the greatest philanderers of all time, JFK, Washington, D.C. being invaded and the White House burned during the War of 1812, which it's amazing we survived as a nation after the War of 1812, 2 world wars, 2 major terror attacks from Pearl Harbor and 9/11, just to name a few things, and we're concerned about one man or woman or just a handful of people totally running the country into the ground in 4 to 8 years. Yeah, I think we have a problem with politics and power being an idol in our country, if you look at what we've come through. While there's nothing wrong with politics and supporting a particular candidate for any office, we need to remember that idols are often good things that are taken to an extreme. There's nothing wrong with maintaining social values, but when you take it to an extreme, it often becomes racism. There is nothing wrong with wanting freedom from an oppressive or unsympathetic government, but the French Revolution went too far and created the Reign of Terror. There's nothing wrong with wanting to return to national relevance or greatness, but the Nazi Party under Hitler obviously went way too far in that. And so one final thought about politics for us as Seventh-day Adventists. What does this mean for us? We should not be too closely aligned or deeply aligned with either political party, any political party, because ultimately God is in control, right? But if you look at it from a practical aspect, Republicans will, in the right, will be against us because of the Sabbath. Democrats and the left will be against us because of our biblical stance that homosexuality is a sin. And of course, there's other factors that factor into both of these things as well. But these are just two examples where either side can go against us. And honestly, we're seeing how vindictive both political parties can be if you just turn on the news. Revelation 13 also reveals that there will be political unity against anyone who does not go along with the majority and remains faithful to God. We've seen this within the last year with the unity that is, you're not wearing a mask. How dare you not wear a mask? And, and it's just a stepping stone to get to the next level. So vote or don't vote. I don't care. I don't care who you vote for, but don't be too politically inclined. Don't be too involved. We need to keep our focus on God and the fact that He is in control. Look, end time events are coming regardless of who is going to be in office. And we need to stay loyal to God and to no matter what. So in Isaiah chapter 14, where does power, this idol for power, come from? Isaiah 14, 12 through 14, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, so son of the morning. How are you cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the furthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. The desire for power that we have is a result of sin. Lucifer developed several idols, matter of fact, all the idols, but the first one being pride, and the second being power. He wanted God's power and position. And in these verses, we find that he was wanting to be better and higher and have more authority than God. He wanted to be more powerful than God. Now, it's important to note that he didn't want to get rid of God. He's the smartest being ever created. He knew that God is the creator and the sustainer of all life. So if you get rid of the life source, what happens to all life? It dies. So he's not wanting to kill God. He's wanting to be higher than God. He just wants to be in control. And so in Revelation and in the sanctuary, we find that God's throne is represented by the table of showbread. And Lucifer said that he wanted a throne. Kings sit on thrones. And so he wants to rule as a king. And then he wants his throne on the furthest side of the north. The table of showbread was found on the north side of the sanctuary, or of the tabernacle. And so he wants his throne on the furthest side of the north. He wants it further and higher than the throne of God, because he said, I want to ascend to the heights of the clouds. I want to be higher than anything. And while there's nothing wrong with being a leader or maximizing your potential, to grasp for power and to try to get a place above that, what God has planned for you, is a problem. You know, we all have talents and abilities, but we are not all equal in those talents and abilities. The parable of the talents reveals this, because the master gave to his servants talents, each according to their ability. And when a servant proved his ability with this amount of talent that he had been given, he was then given more responsibility, more power. But when the servant with the one talent proved unfaithful, what his responsibility was taken from him. And so in Genesis chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, this is how Satan tempts our parents. Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good from evil." Power is how Satan tempted our parents and seduced our parents into sinning. Eve was told that she would have power in 3 ways if she ate the fruit. First, that she would not die. Now, this is an outright lie, but she was told she would have the power over death. Secondly, her eyes would be opened, that she would see and really understand what's going on around her. And third, that she would be like God. Now, there's 2 interesting things. Verse 4 is a total lie. But in verse 5, it's interesting. Everything Satan says here is true. And, because he says, in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open. And then you'll be like God, knowing good from evil. In verse 7, it says that after they ate the fruit, the first thing that happened was their eyes were opened. And they noticed they were naked. In verse 22, after God's speaking with them, he says that man is now like us, has become like one of us, knowing good from evil. So verse 5 here is completely true. It's interesting how the devil will use truth to his benefit when it suits him. But the second thing that's interesting about this is that he uses this knowing good from evil. Why would Satan use this argument? Because he was offering her the power of knowledge. The power of knowledge. We are curious by nature. We want to find answers to things that we don't know, right? This is why we Google stuff all the time, because we want to know what the answer is. This isn't anything new. One of the best, and the devil still uses this same argument today, one of the best examples of this is for those commercials about psychics. The whole premise of those commercials is, you don't know your future, but I can tell you. Call me up, give me some money, I'll tell you what's in your future. And while I would never go to one, they're designed to get yourself wondering, what's going to happen in my future? Because we want to know mysteries. We like mysteries by trying to unravel them, right? We want to know, we want to learn. God created us to want to know and learn. And, secrets are an interesting thing. We love secrets when we know a secret because it gives us power. I know something you don't know. But we hate it when someone keeps a secret from us, right? We beg, please tell me, because we don't like not knowing. We don't like having that power of knowledge taken from us. In verse 6, it says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she gave to her husband with her, and he ate." Eve had never looked at this tree as a tree of power before. She had always seen it as the way God described it, something to be avoided. And we can know that this temptation is working on her because instead of leaving, or instead of saying, but God said don't, or, arguing God's point, she doesn't do that. She takes a step back. She looks at the tree again and does so from the perspective of the serpent. And she imagines this tree to be a tree of power the way that the serpent described it. And then she starts noticing things about it that she never noticed before. Well, its fruit really is beautiful. It's just as beautiful as all the other fruit. And it really is a magnificent and majestic tree. It's just as beautiful and outstanding as all the other trees in the garden. But now if you factor in the power of this tree, of what this tree can make her and can do for her if she eats the fruit, suddenly it is not just equal with all the trees, it becomes better. And its fruit must be better. And so she took the fruit and ate it because she made this tree better than what it was. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, and Israel sent and called him, meaning Rehoboam, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam and said, your father, Solomon, made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Here Rehoboam has just become king, and the first time he is officially introduced to his subjects, they petition him to lower taxes. But in their appeal, there's a veiled threat as well. Lower the taxes or we're going to rebel. And so he asked for 3 days to speak with his advisors. And at the end, he chose to take the advice of the young men instead of the older men. And instead of lowering the taxes, they counseled that he should raise the taxes. He probably thought that he was going to call the people's bluff because, after all, I'm the king. I have legitimacy. My grandfather was David. My father was Solomon, who built this kingdom into something that literally was a world power at the time. And I have legitimacy. Who among you has legitimacy to be king? None of you. And so, are you really going to rebel against the legitimate king? And much to his surprise, his plan backfired, and he lost 10 tribes. Rehoboam learned that power can be taken from you if you are unwise. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord, and the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh all the Israelites who came there. In Leviticus chapter 7, God had dictated what portion of the thank and peace offerings were to be given to the priest. It was a specific portion that they were to get. But here we see that it was the custom of Eli's sons to take whatever they wanted. And the account goes on to say that if anyone protested, the servant would threaten violence, and no doubt did on some occasions if he didn't get what he wanted. In addition to, so they were stealing from the people. And so in addition to stealing with the people, they were also having affairs with the women who were employed at the temple. And they did this for 4 reasons. One, because there was no king in Israel at the time, and the highest authority in the land was a judge who happened to be their father, Eli, who was old at this time, maybe 75 plus. Secondly, Eli was also the high priest, which is the second highest position in the nation. And thirdly, they were also priests, and this is the family occupation. One of them was most likely viewed as going to be the next high priest when Eli died. And lastly, even though Eli didn't know about all of this for a long time, when he did find out, he only gave them a stern talking to and nothing else. So if dear old dad, who is the civil leader and the religious leader in the country, did nothing about their antics, who would stop them? Who could stop them? And so Hophni and Phinehas grew so corrupt and continued to abuse their power and position that God sent 2 messages to Eli saying that Hophni and Phinehas would die for their sins. And in the second message given to Samuel whenever he was a boy at night, remember, God said, I will no longer accept sacrifices on their behalf. There is no forgiveness for them because of their abuse of power. There's no salvation left for them because they're abusing their priestly power. Now, I'm not sure which is worse, priests who could do whatever they want because they could and lose their salvation over. I mean, think about this. How good is their ministry on your behalf if they're not saved? So that's one aspect. Or that their father refused to do anything to stop what they were doing, which enabled them to become worse and worse. Now, this Eli was a spiritual man. I mean, if you think about it, he blessed Hannah, didn't know what her request was, and God said, God's going to grant you your request. And she, who was barren, she got pregnant because of his connection with God, and yet he had quite a few failings in his life. But the end result is that all three of them died within a day or two of each other. The Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, and probably the worst part is that many people refused to come to the tabernacle, which caused them to separate themselves from God as a nation on a national level. In 3 John verses 9 and 10, John writes, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. There's actually two different issues that are going on in this church that John is writing about. First is that Diotrephes loves to have the preeminence. The idol of power works very, very well in a religious environment. And very well in religious settings. We've just talked about that with Eli's sons. It creates positions of power with pastor, head elder, deaconesses, church offices. They create positions of power. And so people like Diotrephes usually express their idea of power in different ways before they become a Christian. But once they become Christians, they give up their old habits, whether it's philandering, whether it's this, whether it's that. But if their idol usually remains, and it expresses itself differently in a religious environment. Usually it comes in and reveals with that individual not just wanting, but needing to have church offices and leading out in classes and activities. They always have to be involved. They always have to be near the top. They always have to be involved in the decision-making process and included in major decisions. And the way that you can tell that they're really struggling with power is that if someone disagrees with them, they become argumentative and combative in those situations and with those who disagree with it. Now, the second issue with this church is that there is a conflict between Diotrephes and John. And this is the second problem. It's a result of the first. Few things can damage a local church more and faster than if the head elder and the pastor don't get along. Because you have two individuals, two of the main leaders in the church, and if they don't get along, it does not bode well for that congregation. And that's exactly what is happening here. John has written to the church. We don't know exactly what he wrote, but reading John's other writings, it was most likely an instruction, an encouraging letter, but Diotrephes didn't accept what John had counseled, nor did he accept any other instruction from any of the other church leaders. And on top of that, of not accepting instruction of his superiors, it says that he actually spoke against them. And if anyone in the congregation endorsed what these other church leaders were saying, he had them disfellowshipped. He put them out of the church. They're disfellowshipped. So here you have a person who is in open rebellion against the church hierarchy. And so Diotrephes' lust for power is really incredible, if you think about it. Because who was John? John was one of the 12 apostles, right? He had been with Jesus the longest of literally the longest of any of the disciples. He and Andrew were the first two to join Jesus, right? And John was the only disciple at the crucifixion. He and Peter were at the tomb. And so if you're going to receive any instruction about Jesus in the Christian life, there was no greater authority on the subject than John. Especially since this letter was written late in the first century, John would have been few, if not the only apostle left to have personally been walking with Christ. So there would be no greater authority literally than John to hear from. And so a message from him would have been receiving a letter or a call from the General Conference president. And so, yet this man said, we don't need that kind of message, and we don't want anybody associated with him or with that message. But it's Moses, in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all the men who were on the face of the earth. So not all leaders, obviously, are craving power and hungry for it. Moses did not. Moses was given a great amount of power when God called him to lead Israel. And for 40 years, he used that power effectively and with great success through some very, very trying times and circumstances. He even turned down God's offer to wipe out the Israelites and start a new nation with him twice. Would you be willing and able to turn down that offer? And yet Moses did. And the way that he was able to be so effective and stay sane, literally stay sane, leading 2 million people through the wilderness for 40 years, was because of his meekness and humility. Now, often we describe meekness as not weakness, but meekness is the ability to use the right amount or have the right attitude and the correct amount of force in a given situation. Sometimes some situations require a lot of force and a very strong personality. For instance, Jesus cleansing the temple required a stern attitude, and yet what happened right after Jesus cleansed the sanctuary each time? The children and the sick people came in. Why? Because he changed his demeanor and his outlook. If anybody should have been scared of Jesus, it should have been the children, and yet they were the first people to come to him. So with Moses, he was meek. He had the right attitude, the right amount of force for any situation, and you add to the wisdom of knowing how to handle situations, add to that humility and spending time in God's presence, and you have a leader that is not fazed by much at all. If we go back to Genesis chapter 3, it says, Then the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made for themselves coverings. Adam and Eve, because of their desire for power, they got what they wanted. They got power. They got the power to see their situation. They were now like God and able to know good from evil. They quickly became disillusioned with the power that they had gained when they saw what it had cost them. And unfortunately, that's what power does for us. It hides. The ends justify the means. So long as you can get to the end, it's okay to do whatever you need to do. And most of the time, that is a lie. And when you get there, you realize how much you have lost and given up and sacrificed to get where you are at in the name of power. So how do we get rid of the idol of power out of our lives? First, we need to understand that power is a deep idol. It's not just a surface idol. Like sometimes money, even though money and power are closely related, money's a little bit easier to notice and to see, because if you got a bunch of zeros, if you're doing all these things to get money, it's kind of easier to notice greed than a lust for power. Because the idol of power often passes itself off, often disguises itself in many different ways and different guises. Power often works imperceptibly in a life to change you. And we see this with Daniel, King Saul and King David. Both of them had very similar beginnings. They were both herdsmen. They were very humble individuals, and yet power over a period of years brought them to the place where they could commit murder. In fact, Saul, in his desire for power and maintaining his power, he murdered all the priests except for one. They all Saul ended up even rebelling against God. David took another man's wife. So the results of power are, it initially didn't happen, but over time it obviously changed them. Secondly, for getting rid of it, it is a painful, humiliating process to go through to get rid of the power, any idol, but particularly the idol of power, because power, you want to be somebody great, somebody that people recognize. In order to get rid of that, to be humble, the humbling process is a painful process. Nebuchadnezzar is an example of this. He spent 7 years in madness like an animal because of his abuse of power. Very humbling process for him. And thirdly, we cannot remove idols on our own. Any idol, particularly the idol of power on our own, we have to seek divine help in order to have our desire for power taken away. And again, Nebuchadnezzar is a good example of this. He was warned that in our scripture reading, he had been warned that, look, you better change your ways or else you're going to be humbled. And he tried to do it on his own, and he was good for a year. And as we read in our scripture reading, he said, "Is this not great Babylon, which I have made for my might and my power?" And in that instance, God said, "You know what? You've gone too far." Our last text is in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made of himself no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross." So, of course, Jesus is the best example of how to deal with power. We often hear that the best leaders are ones who don't want to lead, and that's true sometimes. Good leaders are also ones who can relinquish their power, who can give it up. It's no big thing for them to give up their power, and that's quite rare. Usually the best way to see people get nasty is to mess with their money and mess with their power. And you'll find out what spirit they are really in. But not only was Jesus willing to give up all of his power, he actually did it. And so here we find that Jesus takes 6 steps down. First, he is equal with God, doesn't consider that to be robbery with God, but then he made of himself no reputation. That's the first step down. Then he took the form of a bondservant, and he came in the likeness of men. And then being found as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. 6 steps down Jesus took in his ministry and his life. 6 steps where he removed power from his life. Now in the next 3 verses, in verses 9 through 11, which we're not going to look at, Paul reveals that because Jesus willingly humbled himself, that God has and will exalt him 7 ways. He's going to give it a name above every other name, exalted, and every knee shall bow and every tongue confess. And so there's 6 steps down, but then God gives him 7 steps back up. So when we humble ourselves to God and surrender ourselves to him and let him take care of the idol of power in our lives, he will make sure that we will eventually receive more than we lost by being humble. Just ask Job, who remained humble and in all this did not sin and was blessed, not only with twice as much wealth, but he was given another 110 years of life, 10 more children. God abundantly blessed him. And so just as Jesus' power and authority was returned to him with his victory over sin, he promises to give us power that we can't even imagine. Eternal life, just that. We can't, everything we know has a beginning, has an end. And yet to live forever is a power that we can't even imagine. And he's willing to give this to us if we surrender to him and allow him to remove the idol of power, which ultimately is an illusion. It's an illusion of power that this world has to offer us. And our closing hymn